1 minute at a time.
I was blind, but now I see.
Working jobs we hate, so we can buy shit we don't need.
Ideas are breakfast.
If you had one shot,
Everything I'd ever read, heard, seen was now organized and available.
Now you fucking khakis.
life moves pretty fast.
The Biohacking Secret Show.
Dr. J.W. Richards is a research assistant professor in the Busch School of Business at the Catholic University of America, a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and the executive editor of The Stream. Richards is author or editor of more than a dozen books, including the New York Times bestsellers Infiltrated, published in 2013, and Indivisible, published in 2012, The Human Advantage, and Eat, Fast, Feast. His newest book is The Price of Panic: How the Tyranny of Expert turned a pandemic into a catastrophe. Dr. Richards, welcome to the Biohacking Secret Show.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
I'm pumped to chat. Let's dive right into some of the good stuff, and we'll let the flow take us wherever it wants.
Great.
How dangerous is COVID-19?
Well, it depends on who you are. And so if you are over 70 and you have so-called comorbidities, so let's say you're obese, you have lung problems, you have type 2 diabetes, you're probably nearing the end of your life, then it can be fairly dangerous. If you're healthy and you're young and you don't have any of these things, it's actually not that dangerous. It's something like the flu. People don't like it when you make that comparison, but the irony is that it's quite different from the flu in that it's really differentiates different populations. So if you're under 20, you're about 4 or 5 times more likely to get sick and die from complications of the flu than from COVID-19. If you're over 70 and you have problems, you're more likely to die from complications of COVID-19 than the flu. And so it sort of averages out. And so that's why it's hard to make a kind of simple generalization, because it really depends upon who you are. But I think that emphasizes why a public health response needs to take account of these differences, as opposed to treating the entire population as if we're all exactly alike.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's growing, I don't even want to say division, because I think a lot of people are actually starting to recognize the divide and conquer tactic and say, all right, this is ridiculous. Let's instead awaken to our oneness and, recognize that, like, left, right, we need both, right? You need both the left hemisphere of your brain and the right hemisphere of your brain to make good decisions, depending on, what is the circumstance you're facing. But let's say there's different hypotheses. There's people who believe the mainstream narrative that this is like a naturally occurring virus that came out of, a wet market in China. There's people who believe that it was a bioweapon that was produced, a chimeric virus that was produced via gain of functions research and intentionally released in order to justify a lot of the lockdowns and, this consolidation of wealth that's taken place. And, similar to what a lot of people believe happened with 9/11, where that ushered in the Patriot Act, et cetera. Then there's people who believe that a lot of the symptomology that people are experiencing is electrical illness, due to the rollout of 5G, and this radiation is making people sick. Some people think it's a combination thereof. Where do you kind of sit? I mean, it's interesting that whether we believe it's a naturally occurring virus or something that was a bioweapon, it's interesting that neither Koch's postulates nor Rivers' postulates have been met almost a year in. So I'm kind of curious on what your philosophy is.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, you've sort of laid out the whole spectrum of possibilities there, and there's a million sort of variations in that. But I would say the most benign hypothesis is that this is just a purely natural virus. It came from a bat that, this is the original story, that was in a wet market in Wuhan. The bats don't come from that part of China, so it would have had to have been imported. And it got out. There was a mutation, and it became susceptible to humans. It could be transmitted by humans. That's one extreme. On the other extreme would be these, something that you're saying. It's actually something completely different, unrelated to the virus. And then somewhere in the middle, I would say, would be the idea that it leaked, at least probably accidentally, from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I think at the moment that's, now there are a bunch of other things that are possible, but I would say based on the evidence, if we had to guess in this book, The Price of Panic, that I wrote with a biologist and a statistician, we argue that the most likely hypothesis, based on what we know right now, is that it leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We thought from the very beginning that this wet market story sounded like a cover story. It just seemed very unlikely. The fact that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is there, that we already knew that they're doing work on these bats, and that the State Department a couple of years ago, now it's been about 3 years, was actually worried and issued a report to the U.S. government saying we're worried about this lab. Now, there is also the discussion that this was not a naturally occurring virus. It's not exactly a bioengineered weapon, but that it was the result of this gain of function experiments, and effectively trying, you basically manipulate a virus in order to make it more dangerous, not to kill people, but to try to create vaccines. And then it leaked out. I actually think at the moment, we've always thought that was a possibility. We just think that we need more evidence for that, because the reason is that the virus, if you look at the sequence, the RNA sequence, it is very similar to the naturally occurring viruses that we know are in these bats. And so it's perfectly possible that natural mutations could have led to this. It's not some highly exotic virus that you would expect from a bioweapon. On the other hand, if you're doing gain of function experiments, basically what that's doing is it's speeding up what could happen over time in nature. And so I think honestly, it's going to require us to get some more research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology to figure that out. Now, I would say, however you sort of go with that, I think probably it was an accidental leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and we'll find out hopefully if it was a result of bioengineering or not. The effects are the same either way. So certain people, I don't think that this is a conspiracy by Amazon and big tech to destroy small business and help themselves. That has been the effect, right? The effect has been that it's been very good for the digital economy, very bad for the sort of the analog economy. And so you can ask those questions and say, okay, who benefited from that? Even if you don't think, okay, the people that benefited necessarily orchestrated it, because any event's going to benefit certain people. I do think the long and the short of it is that the People's Republic of China and the government of China definitely bears responsibility for this, either because of a leak, which is itself a disaster, or something much more sinister.
For sure. And, this was largely something that I came to realize in these past 12 months with a lot of how this has been handled, and it was recognizing that there's a certain amount of what we see on the news and television that is like clearly theater. Yeah. And some of it's valid depending on what sources you go to, but how do you differentiate between what is clearly theater and something that, is designed to push an agenda? And because there's a lot of people that see that and they struggle to, and it makes them very angry or upset or fearful and pulls them into these lower states of vibration and consciousness. Yeah. How do you differentiate between what you should pay attention to that seems valid and legit and what seems like political or, news theater?
Yeah, it's very, very hard. I'd say we live at this moment in which if you have discernment, I think that's honestly the more traditional term is just wisdom. So the ability to separate the wheat from the chaff, essentially, and to be able to say, okay, look, there seems to be evidence for this. That's a good argument. What's the counter argument? Being able to exercise that has never been more important. The good news is that we actually have access to information. We wrote our book, The Price of Panic, during the lockdown, when I couldn't even go to a library, but I still had access because the internet and search engines to find this stuff. At the same time, I think social media bombards us with so much information, including a lot of disinformation. And we have to remind ourselves that the media is highly incentivized to terrify us constantly. Really isn't a market for, okay, let's be careful, let's weigh the evidence, let's look at both sides, right? There's just not a big market for that. But of course, every scary thing that you see, you're tempted to click on. It's just kind of human psychology. And so you got to really remind yourself, okay, there's an incentive constantly to terrify me. And so I need to discount what I see based on that. It doesn't mean there's never anything scary, but you constantly are reminding yourself of that. And then there really ultimately isn't a substitute for doing careful research, for looking, okay, any argument, you want to know what's the strongest argument on the other side, any piece of evidence, what's the best argument against it? Because really good evidence and arguments, they hold up under scrutiny in that way, whereas ones that don't, they tend to fall apart. And so very often, we hear an argument, it sounds good to us. There's a proverb actually in the Old Testament in the Bible that says, basically when you hear one side of an argument, it sounds good to you until you hear the other side. And so if you don't know what the other side even is, you're probably not in a position to be able to evaluate it carefully. And so that's honestly, it's what we want to do in this book, is to say, okay, look, we don't think everything the media is telling you is false, but we do think in this case that there's very much a kind of a media campaign of hysteria that really led to the panic. I mean, we think the story of 2020 is the not that important of a story is the nature of this virus, because it's in some ways it's not a historic coronavirus. It's comparable in its dangers to maybe the Hong Kong flu of 1968 or something like that. What's historic is this planetary simultaneous panic that is still enthralled the world. We think that's what historians 50 years ago from now will still be talking about when I talk about 2020.
Right. I mean, I saw, the amount of memes that have come across my desk this past year is unprecedented. But I saw one the other day and it showed suicide deaths and people were yawning, and then it said heart attack deaths and people were yawning, and it said cancer deaths and people were yawning, and then it said coronavirus cases.
Yes.
With the test that we know produces false positives, and everyone was freaking out, in terror. And I mean, what explains the panicked reaction that we're seeing around the globe?
Yeah, it's a complicated series of events. I mean, the first is that there were these predictive computer models in March. The infamous one is the so-called Imperial College London model, led by a scientist named modeler named Neil Ferguson, which predicted basically a computer model is a complex argument in which you simulate certain things based upon the assumptions that you plug in. And so they plugged into this model this assumption that the coronavirus was going to have a 3.4% infection fatality rate, which would have made it way more deadly than the Spanish flu. Made all sorts of assumptions about how contagious it was, about what people would do. And then they assumed in the model that lockdowns would help to reduce this. So those are all assumptions in the model. And that's where we got this number that 2.2 million Americans were going to die if we didn't do a lockdown. It wasn't based on evidence. It was the model itself. But the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, he glommed onto this model. He told the public health officials in the United States. And so when President Trump was advised by his scientific advisors, President Trump said, well, I was told, Trump said this on April 8th, if we didn't shut down the country, 2.2 million Americans were going to die. That number came directly from this Imperial College London model. It was not based upon evidence. And as soon as we got real data about the coronavirus, we knew it was flawed. But now the kind of public health machine in the world was already moving. And then you had the media highlighting these particular public health officials, highlighting these computer predictions. I mean, I can tell you when we were working on the book, even as late as April, when anyone in the know knew the computer model was worthless, you could still Google what's the infection fatality rate of COVID-19, and it would just tell you 3.4%. That's how instantaneous imagine this, a single predictive computer model, maybe half a dozen public health officials, because they had the ear of very important politicians, had the power to shut down the world. And that's a terrifying thing. And we think one of the lessons of this is that we need to separate public policy decisions and predictive computer models so that you do not rely on a predictive computer model until it's after it's been tested against the evidence. That didn't happen in this case. It was just based on assumptions prior to the evidence. And that's absolutely catastrophic. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, but most of the people in the media, I mean, by most, I mean like 99% of people in the media simply do not have the intellectual capacity or just the background knowledge to know how to evaluate these claims from computer models. They just think, oh, it's science. And that's sort of as far as they go. And, any of us that have some experience with these computer models, that's what got us worried about this already in March, is we thought, okay, this is going to be a disaster because we're making decisions not based upon real evidence, but based upon speculative modeling.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you're aware, but our listeners may not be. The Imperial College of London is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And Bill Gates, for those who haven't seen it, there's a video of him presenting to, I believe it was the CIA around about 2005, where, or I'm actually confusing references, but Bill Gates has publicly said that vaccines are the best investment he's ever made and typically produce a 20-to-1 return. That's tough to mimic anywhere else in the market, so you can start to see, when you follow the money and ask who has a motive, and you start to see the connections, it does sort of shine a light on various possibilities, right? I'm not making any allegations. Sure. I don't want anything that Bill Gates has, but I do find some of these connections interesting.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the Gates Foundation. I mean, Bill Gates was, for a long time, he's the richest man in the world and a great entrepreneur and founder of Microsoft. And then he has become the largest philanthropist in the world. He is deeply invested, as you say, in vaccines and things that, at least on the surface, look good. And I think in his own heart, I think he probably maybe means well. But I think the reality is he's one of the major donors to the World Health Organization. And so you end up with a few people like this. I mean, the World Health Organization is the public health arm of the United Nations. And a lot of people, when you hear that, you think, well, these are just going to be doctors and people that want to help people. But the public health is itself a kind of political thing. And so if you're at the United Nations, the United Nations is not a hospital. And so even if it has a division that deals with public health, it's also, in a sense, a kind of political thing. And you realize that. And that's why, I mean, sickness and health should not be partisan or political issues, but they end up being that. And I think we've seen that this year, is that there's really no more powerful way to control a population than with a public health argument, because first of all, none of us want to be sick, and we don't have to be sick, and we don't want to make other people sick. And so I think it's a very, very powerful tool for social control. And I think that's why it merits maybe more scrutiny than we've been willing to give it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly does seem that until on a mass level, we have adopted some of these mental exercises you described of discernment, yes. A willingness to examine in detail both sides of an argument and then apply critical thinking and our intuition as well to that process. And until we can take in information without necessarily having some knee-jerk emotional response, especially a knee-jerk emotional response that takes us down into these lower vibratory states of consciousness, like fear, anger, frustration. The people who don't develop those skill sets could risk being left behind. There's a lot of, and for some that may look like death in the worst case scenario. For others, it may just be kind of falling into this technocracy where they have a lot of their freedoms taken away, and they're being monitored 24/7 by all of the quote unquote smart devices that we've surrounded ourselves with. What would you say is the price of panic?
It's really, really steep. I mean, you actually mentioned it a few minutes ago. We focus on not even COVID deaths. We're talking about COVID cases, which of course is hugely problematic, because cases used to mean you were sick enough that you needed to get treatment and then you were tested positive. Now, a case just is anybody that happens to get a positive test. And when you're dealing with these highly cycled PCR tests, you have massive false positives. And so the case isn't really even the thing you want to care about. But the very fact that, for instance, we've missed tens of thousands of cancer screenings, an early estimate that the first 3 months of the lockdowns probably led to about 85,000 missed cancer screenings just basically in April, May, and June. I mean, think of that. So it's 85,000 people who going to the doctor, they'd have cancer that would get detected and could get treated, missed just in that first 3 months of the lockdowns. One estimate early on thought there'd be 75,000 excess deaths of despair in 2020. So that's deaths from suicide and drug and alcohol overdose, all caused from the lockdowns. Those deaths of despair aren't the result of the coronavirus. Those are the result of people, being depressed because they lost their jobs because the entire country is locked down, or you're a student and you're locked at home. That is very hard for human beings. We're social creatures. And so to do this, those are just two, kind of low-hanging fruit. Those are the price of panic. We know that it probably costs the economy when we're locked down about $1 trillion a month. Of course, the dollars aren't the main thing. Those dollars stand in for people's jobs and healthcare and meals and rental payments and all those kinds of things. In fact, another arm of the United Nations, if you look at it globally, the UN World Food Program estimated that we could very quickly get to a situation where you have about 300,000 deaths globally per day from the lockdowns, just from the disruption to the global food supply chain. Now, I don't know, because that was, again, based on a predictive model. We don't know if that will pan out. But let's say it's 30,000. Let's say they overestimated it by 10 times. Well, 30,000 extra deaths of starvation every single day doesn't take very long before the price of the lockdowns, that is the price of the panic, ends up exceeding all the attributed deaths from the coronavirus itself. That's the very definition of a bad response. If you have a response to a danger that kills more people than the danger itself, that was a really, really stupid response. What you want to have is you want to maximize the benefits and reduce the costs. And unfortunately, we argue in the book, if you look at the lockdowns, if you look at most of the responses, these were mostly all pain and no gain, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and paying, PAYING, when you look at the costs on the taxpayers of governments across the world to implement these tests. My friends that have flown have sent videos of just lines and lines and lines of people doing these tests that, in the case of the PCR test, the creator, Carrie Mullis, Mullis, has publicly said should not be used for this. It is not accurate. It will produce false positives. And he even went further to say that Dr. Anthony Fauci knows very little about these tests and a lot of the things that he's discussing publicly. And we've kind of ran into this case where the cure is worse than the disease, which I believe President Trump said early on. I'd heard a very interesting statistic that was the leading cause of death in 2020. This year that's been overshadowed by the corona. The leading cause of death was abortion. Oh yeah, lost over 42 million lives to abortion. And when you realize that in comparison, cancer's around 8 million, heart disease a little bit less, and coronavirus, even with the inflated numbers, doctors and medical professionals have validated that they've seen death certificates changed. And, there's people that died in car accidents and heart attacks that were labeled coronavirus. So we know these numbers are fraudulent. There was still only 1.9 million people that died of coronavirus using those statistics in 2020. So we have this case of almost misdirection, like you see from an illusionist or a magician, where so many people are dying from abortion, cancer, suicide, these deaths of despair, as you mentioned, financial ruin, people not going to the hospitals for something because they're scared of what could happen.
No, I mean, I think the key point is that people don't know the baseline. So, of course, it's not like everybody walks around knowing, okay, how many people die, say, of heart disease every day, either worldwide or in the United States. Most of us have no idea. We have no idea how many abortions, for instance, which is an unbelievable baseline, of course. And so you don't actually know. What everybody assumes is that every death you hear for coronavirus, you assume is that it's a death on top of everyone that would otherwise have died. But that's not the case. And we know that because the average age of death attributed to coronavirus is very close to the expected the general life expectancy in the United States. In fact, it's within about a year. And so if you have a thing that's causing people to die very close to the average life expectancy, that tells you that it's really, in these cases, a contributing factor to death. It's very much like flu and colds were. And so the reality is that if you look, lots and lots of people, if you survive cancer, if you survive heart disease, you tend to die, if it's not an accident, from complications related to pneumonia. So you get the flu, you get a cold, you get pneumonia, and then you die. That's just that, we have a limited life expectancy. And so that's what happens. That's primarily what the coronavirus is doing. And so it's basically occupying that same space that the flu is occupying. Now, I think in the first year or two, it's going to be more dangerous than that because we don't have as much exposure and immunity to it. But that's very much what it's like. And so this idea that we should have responded to it as if it was some, as the Black Death, as if it was the plague or something, we were bound, I think, to end up with a response that was really, as President Trump said almost a year ago, a cure that was worse than the disease. You want to respond to something with the risk that's appropriate. So, I mean, if you have an earache, you don't dig your ear out of your head. That obviously would be an inappropriate response. But we had on this assumption that it was highly infectious, that there's all this asymptomatic spread, and that it had a 3.4% infection fatality rate, is that we responded in a way that was sort of appropriate to that false assumption. But we also responded in a way that wasn't even known would help. So this idea of population-wide lockdowns, we didn't even have evidence that would help. That's the irony. You can say, well, maybe we did too much of it, but it'd be one thing to respond too harshly. It's another thing to respond stupidly. And that's what population-wide lockdowns are. They're kind of a stupid response. A smart response would be isolate the people that you know are infectious, really focus your protection then on the people that are high risk, like elderly people in nursing homes, and then you let the rest of the people live their lives. That'd be a rational quarantine, which is what we always did in the past. But what we did in 2020 is we said, let's try this other thing where we basically lock the entire population down and we just assume ahead of time that it will help. Well, at least you could have said in March, we don't know if it would have worked. Well, we knew by May or June. We did this in the book. You compare all the states to each other, you compare all the countries to each other, and then you mark the ones that had a lockdown and when they had the lockdowns, and then you can look and see, okay, is there a signature in the noise? That is a signal in the noise where you see a bend in those curves 10 days out after the lockdowns. Well, that's what would happen if they actually worked. What we discovered is there's absolutely no signal in the noise. In other words, the virus just is completely indifferent to these government lockdowns. So all those costs to the lockdowns, those are literally all just costs. There's no benefits on the other side of the ledger to counterbalance that.
Absolutely. And guys, if you're enjoying this conversation, support Dr. J.W. Richards by picking up his book, The Price of Panic. It's available on Amazon right now. If Amazon happens to take it down, I'm sure you can just use a simple search engine to find a bookstore that does have it. So that's if you like the work that people are doing and the stuff that they're putting out into the world, support them by picking it up. So grab The Price of Panic at Amazon. Dr. Richards, one of the issues that I'm seeing show up as a problem is liability protection. Mm-hmm. With vaccines, we have, I believe it was called the Vaccine Injury Act around 1985 that passed, that basically like these pharmaceutical companies are able to hurt people with vaccines and experience no recourse. Mm-hmm. Where families can't go after them. We have this vaccine court that is largely at least alleged by many people to be corrupt, and even so still has paid out billions, I believe in excess of $4 billion in damages to families and who had children injured from vaccines. When we talk about these models that are also being used, it seems like there's also liability protection for those. Is Neil Ferguson going to have to answer to this erroneous and inaccurate model that he created? Because the way that I see it, until liability protection is removed and accountability is reinstilled, this is going to be a repeating problem with models and vaccinations. What are your thoughts? Yeah,
I mean, it's a really complicated issue, and I don't know about vaccines in general. I do know let's talk about the models. I mean, because in principle, what the way you need markets to to work, for a market to work, a company that succeeds in doing something should enjoy benefits, but a company that harms people should also suffer the consequences. That's when you have that scenario, right? It's balanced out and then a market works really well. If a private company has some liability protection that prevents it from ever having to suffer consequences for bad actions, then you're likely to get a bad outcome. And so I think that there's probably some corruption in the process. I don't know enough about it to really speak strongly on it. I do know that in the case of I think 3 vaccines, the 2 American ones, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, at the moment, the success of these vaccines is mainly press release information. I mean, just by definition, we haven't been able to test these vaccines as we would like to have and as vaccines normally would have. Now, if we're dealing with something like Ebola, where people catch a virus, they just drop over dead, then you say, okay, well, the risk is worth it. Even if there's like a 10% chance it's going to kill you. Well, if there's a 30% chance the bug's going to kill you, maybe it's worth it. We're not dealing with that situation though. And so that's what's sort of perplexing about it. So that somebody that's like a really high risk might say, okay, I'm willing to take the risk of an untested vaccine that might harm me. But if you have very, very little likelihood of getting severely sick, let alone dying, I don't understand why you would get a vaccine. And so that's the kind of thing that people should be able to make those kinds of decisions for themselves, rather than being sort of badgered into doing this because it's going to help everyone else. Taking a vaccine that's untested when you're at very little risk from the thing you're being vaccinated against, that's too much. And I think that's what we're really dealing with. I mean, the truth of the matter is we don't know what the long-term effects of this vaccine are. And so I've told people that have asked me, I said, look, well, I had a COVID-19 a few months ago, and so I wouldn't do it anyway. But even if not, I'm not nearly high risk enough of a category that I would do this unless I was just literally forced to do it. And if I were under 20, I would absolutely not want to be doing this, And so, that's really the worry. Now, you said something about liabilities for these model predictors. They have none. This is the irony that we talk about in The Price of Panic, is that that people that produce these predictive models, they can go wrong again and again. In fact, Neil Ferguson at the Imperial College London has had a 20-year history of creating these computer models that predict huge catastrophic consequences and various pandemics, from the bird flu and swine flu and different things that don't pan out. And he never has suffered any consequences for it. And again, it sort of has to do with incentives. And so if you let's say you work for the government and you predict that something's going to kill 1 million people, and so you do something and only 1,000 people die, well, then people will say, oh, good, I'm so glad. Either I'm glad it wasn't as bad as you thought, or they'll say, oh, our response must have saved everyone, right? And so you don't get any trouble. On the other hand, if you say, oh, well, this won't kill anybody, and then it kills 1 million people, well, you're going to lose your job. And so they have a very strong incentive for overestimating the dangers and underestimating the dangers of a response, because essentially they don't suffer the consequences. And so that's why we think the public has to apply more critical scrutiny to any claim that's based on an untested computer model, especially if it's being used by government public health officials, because you already know that they have a very strong incentive to panic and to overpredict the deadliness of something. And so you have to sort of discount it when you're thinking, okay, how much credence should I give to this?
Mm-hmm. And, we're seeing in many of the different industries, the medical industrial complex, it's really healthcare, education, everything. But we're seeing these patterns kind of emerge where there's potentially a great deal of corruption at the top.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, what safeguards or checks and balances exist, in our judicial system? Let's say the United States first, because I'm sure you're not an expert in, you're not a lawyer, right? Neither am I. And it's important to say that. But just hypothetically, like, what safeguards exist? Is there any bottom-up checks and balances where the people that know some of this corruption is taking place, if the disciplinary actions and corrective measures are not taken from the top, perhaps because of corruption. Yeah. What can we do? Is there anything? Are lawyers that see what's happening and want to make the world a better place? What options may exist?
Well, I honestly think that the irony here, I get really frustrated with what happens on a lot of things when it comes to American courts. But the courts have been mostly good. Like if a governor has locked down a state and say a church or a private business takes the state to court, the courts almost always side in favor of the plaintiff. That is against the government overreach. And so the reality is that state governors in general have about a 30-day emergency action window. So basically, if you have a tsunami and the governor doesn't have time to call an assembly, they have these emergency powers, but they're very limited in their time. And so we're out, what are we, about 9 months out now? And so what's happened, I live in Washington, D.C., and I can tell you in the District of Columbia, it's a mayor that's in charge of this, and she was locking everything down. And the problem wasn't that people were suing her and, she was getting to do what she was wanting to do. It's that people and organizations were themselves scared and not willing to do it and not willing to actually take them to court. And so in many cases, I think what we needed to do is be, as a population, less compliant. I'm not saying we should be violent. I am saying that as long as we are willing to comply, as long as a large percentage of us think, well, this is what is going to have to happen, and we're going to all just comply with it, it's going to happen. And I honestly think that's the only kind of bottom-up control we have. I mean, if an entire town just decides, okay, this is ridiculous, we're not going to just keep our businesses closed, we'll take all necessary precautions, we're not going to keep doing this, there wouldn't really be any way to enforce a lockdown. There really is no way to do that. It's only because 99% of the population is complying with these things that they're actually happening. And so, I worry that this will continue until a kind of critical mass of the population just decides, okay, peacefully, non-violently, we're not going to do this anymore. And that's why, in some ways, they're committed to keeping us terrified, because if we're terrified, we're going to comply. If we actually think the lockdowns and the handkerchiefs over our face at the gym are really making a difference, right, then we're going to keep doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
This episode of the Biohacking Secrets Show is brought to you by Veritas Farms and their full line of CBD products, CBD standing for cannabidiol. Now, we are real excited about this partnership because Veritas means truth in Latin, and we are big believers in bringing you guys the truth, not just through this podcast, but by making sure that any products that we share or that we bring on as sponsors are products that we personally use, believe in, and endorse ourselves. And that is the case with Veritas Farms and their full line of CBD products. The reason that they're so great, they are full spectrum hemp products, meaning that they have all of the beneficial phytonutrients that you get in a quality CBD product. 99% of the CBD products on the market are CBD isolate, and they're just being resold, meaning they're coming from a few small manufacturers. They've only got one tiny part of all of the important phytonutrients that you need to get the benefits you want from a CBD product, and they're just a bunch of different companies reselling them. Veritas Farms is vertically integrated, meaning they own the farm. They ensure that there are no pesticides being added. It's organic, and then they control the entire process from harvesting to extraction until that product ends up at your door. That's what I love it. It's kind of like farm to table, but for CBD. And the benefits that I've noticed, my sleep is better. I feel like I get a deeper, more restful night's sleep. I'm less stressed. I never have periods of anxiety. I feel calm and focused throughout the day. And it even decreases inflammation when I have flights or other things where inflammation is an inevitable part of life. You take a little extra CBD and it can be very helpful for stress, anxiety, sleep, and that inflammation. So if you guys want to check it out, we've arranged a 15% discount for you guys. To get that, you can go to theveritasfarms.com/biohacks. I'll spell it out. THEVERITASFARMS.com/BIOHACKS to save 15%. Check out the Veritas Farms CBD. You guys are going to absolutely love it.
I think we would benefit from more people stepping up and saying, no, this is ridiculous. This is tyranny. It's not based on science. And additionally, like we do need to call for more accountability and, be willing to kind of go against at least the herd that is just fearful and compliant. Right. You mentioned that you had coronavirus and therefore would not be getting the vaccine. Perhaps you could explain your logic there a little bit, because I think a lot of our listeners may have also had it themselves and would be interested in your reasoning there.
Absolutely. And so, on the assumption that this is like other coronaviruses, and there are, of course, discussions of different strains, but I don't think that these things mutate. They just don't. They don't mutate as quickly as the flu. So there's no reason to assume you're going to get a new strain every single year. If you genuinely had, so it wasn't a false positive, you genuinely are infected with SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the virus itself, but we'll just call it the coronavirus, then you're almost certainly mostly immune to it. Now, it might be that you could get some kind of low level of infection, but it's very likely that you have various forms of immunity, including specific antibodies against the coronavirus. And so it really doesn't make any sense that you'd have to get a vaccine. In fact, we're told that even these vaccines that weirdly don't actually confer really good immunity. But apparently what they're supposed to do is just reduce the severity of symptoms, which is ironic. So it means that actually getting it is kind of the best way to build up an immunity to the bug. And so, there's debate about how long the immunity lasts, and we don't know. I think it almost certainly will last for years. In fact, I actually think, I can't prove this, but I think a lot of people in East Asia actually already had some pre-existing immunity. It's very hard to explain why have so few Japanese and South Koreans and Taiwanese, why have so few of them died from this. And we think, well, probably the best explanation is that they had already been exposed to some coronaviruses that were similar to this. My co-author, William Briggs, for The Price of Panic, he got trapped in Taiwan for the entire duration of the time we were writing the book. He was over there for business and couldn't get back to the US. Well, Taiwan didn't have a lockdown. They are an island country, but they had very few deaths. They didn't have problems with it. And we think, okay, and this was poo-pooed initially, but we really think there were probably some pre-existing population immunity to it, not this particular coronavirus, but one that was similar enough. Otherwise, it's very hard to explain why you get so many deaths in places like the UK, but so few deaths in places like Vietnam. And so we suspect there was some of that. So this kind of pre-existing immunity. And then, of course, if you've had it yourself with this coronavirus, you're going to have the antibodies for some amount of time that are going to keep you from really getting sick from it. And so that's why I'm not worried about it. I mean, I feel like in some ways it was a relief. I mean, I got it after the book came out. It was just a couple of months ago around Thanksgiving. And I thought, okay, well, good. Now I've seen it from the first person perspective.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What, when you look at the way that, let's say, the quote unquote masses are responding to what's been going on with C19, and you contrast that with the way that you've been handling it, what are you doing differently? And you could get as granular as you want, from masks to travel to anything. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing different than the masses.
Well, I can tell you that people are different psychologically, and I could say even a difference between my wife and me, for instance. So we get on a plane, and I can easily say, look, this is way safer than driving. I know what the statistics are, and I'm comforted by that. And so I can sleep through turbulence. That kind of statistical calculation doesn't provide her with as much sort of psychological relief. And so I do think it sort of helps if the probabilities help you, right? If you can say, okay, look, I'm going to adjust my emotional state to the likelihood that this is going to happen, then you're going to benefit. Now, the problem is some people are just dispositionally different. But if you're the type that can say, if I could persuade you that you have only a 1 in a million chance of dying from something, will you feel more relaxed? Well, then that's good news, because you can actually just go to CDC and you can run the numbers. All it takes is a little arithmetic, and you'll discover that the coronavirus is just simply not nearly as dangerous as you probably have been led to believe by CNN. So there was a poll in July, a COVID tracking opinion poll that asked Americans what percentage of the population, so it was what percentage of the population had died so far of the coronavirus. So this was in July. The average guess was 9%. So the average American thought 9% of the population had died of the coronavirus. So that would have been utterly catastrophic. I mean, absolutely catastrophic. That'd be like a world war. Mm-hmm. Of course, the number at the time.
What is that, like 30 million people?
Oh, gosh, it's unbelievable. Yeah.
If you're talking just the U.S.
Yeah, just the U.S. It'd be 30 million. Yeah, 30 million people in about a 3-month period, too, right?
And still less than abortion.
No, it's still less than abortion. Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And so, but the actual number was 0.06%. And so that means that people thought that the bug was 150 times more deadly than it actually is. And that's CDC numbers. They're not pulling this out of, some random website. And so we've been led to believe that it's much, much more deadly. And so for me, it was just allowing the data to speak and then kind of adjusting myself emotionally. And so I'm still careful during flu season. I don't like to catch the flu, if people are, I don't get around people that have the flu. And so in the same way, if somebody has coronavirus, I wouldn't be hanging around them, and be careful. And so, but it would be adjust appropriately. I said, okay, let's say this is maybe 4 times worse than the flu. Then my response rationally should be about 4 times more cautious than I would, during the flu season. And that would be appropriate to the evidence. And so it's really just a matter of, it's the traditional virtue of prudence, which is to see the world as it is and to adjust your actions accordingly. So you want to know what's the reality like, and then you adjust your behavior to reality. And that's really, it's not that much more complicated than this. And so it's not like, let's go have a COVID party and get sick. I mean, that's silly. On the other hand, I'm not going to get all that much more worked up about it than I would for the flu, given my particular situation in life.
Mm-hmm. You do raise a good question. I mean, how ridiculous is it to have a COVID party? We know that they did chickenpox parties for a while, just basically in order to confer that herd immunity and that natural immunity. And when you look at some of what they're saying now, where there's a lot of people that believe that this vaccine it shouldn't even be called a vaccine. That's almost a misnomer because it's not introduce the pathogen and then there's lifelong immunity. It's like, you're going to need to get this a lot. And, they're telling you all sorts of justifications from mutation to whatever other nonsense is out there, but it's not a vaccine. It doesn't function like a vaccine. That's right. We probably shouldn't be calling it a vaccine.
You're right. I mean, that is in some ways, that's kind of part of the PR campaign. I mean, we've never had an mRNA drug, we'll call it a vaccine, but there's never been one that has been approved by the FDA. That includes this. So both the Moderna and the Pfizer drugs got a free pass. So basically, we'd never gotten an approved vaccine for a coronavirus, in fact. Like
in 60 plus years of coronaviruses existing.
Exactly. And us dealing with them, we've never done this. And so it tells you that there's something really hard about doing that. And in this case, this is a drug that, let's just assume the press releases are right, that if it doesn't harm you, will somehow reduce your symptoms. Well, that's different. The purpose of a vaccine generally is basically to speed up herd immunity. So we do the flu vaccine, even though that doesn't make everyone immune. If millions of people get it, the idea is that we reach herd immunity in the population quicker than we would otherwise. Same thing with the polio vaccine, right? But if it's not doing that, if they're telling us you still need to wear a mask and you can still catch it, as you said, it's not really a vaccine. It's like maybe a prophylactic or something like that at best. And so that's what's so frustrating about this when you study it, because, the stuff that we were saying that, we started out being conspiracy theorists by saying, okay, this doesn't look like it's supposed to be. Then you're controversial. Then, suddenly CNN is saying what you said 6 months ago as if it's obvious. I mean, that's what we're doing now. We've got Mario Cuomo and the mayor of Chicago saying, oh, we can't keep locking down businesses. Well, thank you. We were saying that 9 months ago. Cost is too great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And, I'm curious, like, put on your law of attraction hat, right? If anything were possible, what, imagine it's 12 months from today. What needs to have happened for us to kind of step outside of this mess?
I think really only one thing needs to happen is that a critical mass of the population needs to basically understand what we're talking about here to really be able to assess this properly, so that there isn't, because right now the media is getting their fix, right? They're incentivized to terrify us. But if more and more of us just say, look, give me a break here, give us some real information, give us some real news, the media itself will be less incentivized. I honestly think that's in some ways, if I could pick one thing, it would just be rather than 50% of the population, have say 80% or 90% of the population realize this. And then I think actually it ultimately goes away, so that, just realizing, okay, don't tell me about cases, tell me about deaths, tell me about the details of the deaths. Just this kind of really basic increase in understanding and discernment on the part of the population. I think that's all that would really be needed, because then I think the other institutions would be incentivized to do something else. A mayor that is going to have just an entire population of her city not comply is not going to just keep doing that, right? She's not going to just keep pushing it. But as long as you have the teachers telling you you're doing the right thing, and you have all the public health officials, and you have 60% of your population thinking you're doing the right thing, then you're going to get away with it. But in general, you live in a city or you live in a state, politicians are elected democratically. And if most of the population says this doesn't make any sense.
Or so we're led to believe.
That's notice I said at the state, the local and the state level. I suspend judgment on the national level, right?
I thought this was a democratic country too, and a democratic process. And now I'm like, okay, it's oligarchs, and we're getting whatever puppets they want.
And so we've got, at least I think the mayor is, at least in my hamlet here, is democratically elected, and they respond to the incentives. Let's put it that way. So if a huge segment of the population gets fed up, I think that they end up doing the right thing. But at the moment, if most of us are terrified, then they're not going to suffer the consequences for bad policies.
Mm-hmm. Be not afraid. Be not afraid, people. This is a problem that really is biblical in its etiology, meaning that, like, if we have a morality issue, that morality issue is that people have become hyper materialistic and started valuing and prioritizing the law of man over the laws of God and natural law. Yeah. And that's what's got us here. And when you're in that headspace of hyper materialism and fearing man rather than God, it can lead you to a pretty dangerous place if you don't get off that track and kind of start realigning your moral and ethical foundations.
I totally agree. I think that's exactly right. And I think, it's strange because none of us would have believed this in 2019, that we'd be told, close your business, don't go to church, don't go to school, and you need to do it for your fellow human beings, and we would all just do it. That would have all sounded totally strange and like the craziest conspiracy theory you've ever heard, and yet it actually happened. And now we treat it as if it's the new normal. That's why we say at the end of the book, we wrote the book against the brave new normal, because our fear is that if we show as a population how easily we will comply with something, as long as it's couched in terms of public health, in terms of our own immortality or mortality or the mortality of our neighbors, that we will easily comply. People are watching. I mean, people that would like to control us are watching that, and they will learn the lesson, and they'll know, okay, every future crisis will be framed in terms of public health. And so we're going to have to, I think, amp up our capacity to discern when that's happening, and to be able to say, okay, look, this is a legitimate thing, or they're using this crisis essentially to do things that they ought not to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also critical for us to recognize the very real possibility that artificial intelligence is being used to constantly assess the collective consciousness. Where is it at, and what content could steer it in a certain direction, right? And this is coming through our phones and our televisions. And, until we really do apply that discernment and become emotionally less attached to things, especially things that come through our devices, through these black screens, we're positioning ourselves to be controlled and allowing ourselves to be controlled.
That's right. And we think that it's not just the kind of traditional media, because of course in 2009 we had a pandemic with the swine flu, and nothing like this happened. We even had social media, but smartphones were only about 2 years old. But what we did not have is direct access like we do now. First of all, social media has utterly penetrated culture in a way that it hadn't in 2009. And then everyone has a smartphone in which you can essentially get high definition video in real time. So an old man can fall over and die on a street in China, and it's uploaded to Instagram, and it's all over the world in a matter of hours. And everybody thinks they're seeing what the coronavirus does. That's a kind of new technological reality. And we have not adapted ourselves either individually, as psychology, in terms of our psychology, or socially, to be able to deal with this type of information. And as you say, especially when it's being highly optimized with artificial intelligence algorithms, so that of course, if we click on something, it's going to be optimized and we're going to get more of it. We have to become much more discerning consumers of social media and of this technology if I think we're going to honestly survive long term.
I completely agree. And it's also critical to understand things like, I think anyone listening with a good heart and a good moral compass would agree that Black Lives Matter. Oh, yeah. And that all lives matter. And I don't know how somehow that became a disrespectful statement, but when you dig a little bit deeper and you start to realize, okay, BLM is a Marxist organization. It literally has Marxist founders, and we're seeing this push with censorship and a lot of what looks like there's a push towards socialism or communism right now. If you don't recognize, okay, BLM is a Marxist organization, and there's a tremendous amount of evidence that what happened with George Floyd was a false flag event, meaning it was something that was orchestrated in order to incite a race war and kind of justify a lot of the things that took place after that. And that may be a surprise to some people here. It's not a conspiracy theory. There's plenty of people who have posed very compelling arguments that is what went down. I think it's critical that we recognize the weaponization of words. You know, this term conspiracy theory that came out, it was released by the CIA. And it was around
I've heard this. I've not researched this, but I find it's somewhat plausible. I mean, the reality is that for any nefarious thing that's happening, think if you're really smart, right? If you're involved in a genuine conspiracy, right, behind the scenes, and you're afraid that the word's going to get out about it, right? Like let's say you've got some honeypot deal in which you're getting compromising video, right, with people doing illegal things, and they're very influential, and you're afraid the word's going to get out about your actual conspiracy. The best way to inoculate yourself against it is to have somebody postulate some really more outlandish version of it, right? And then everybody talks about that, and then it's easy to debunk the outlandish version, and so then you don't have to worry so much about your actual conspiracy being exposed. I think that's always the kind of dilemma, is that I think that we get defanged either by being completely undiscerning, right, on the one hand, in which we just don't know what's actually happening, or we fall for the most outlandish version of something which is so easily debunked that we don't get ourselves in the strongest position. I've always said the real discernment is being able to separate the genuine conspiracies from the from the decoys, that sort of find their way out there.
Totally, it's that process of creating a false binary.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
And especially if the binary that's closest to truth is, as you said, made to look ridiculous. Yeah. Under the purpose of discrediting anyone,
That's right.
sharing it, right? So sometimes the most powerful thing we could do is recognize, okay, the most dangerous number in the world is 2. And it's really only by awakening to our oneness and saying, okay, you don't have to choose left or right. You don't have to choose red or blue. There are beautiful and necessary elements to both, right? That and the application of which is chosen depends on the situation. Yeah. There's been so many people in our community over these past 9-10 months that have, experienced some of those less beneficial emotions, fear, anger, frustration. Yeah. And, one of the things that I'll share that's helped a lot of people is one of my favorite songs. It's by John Prine, and it's called Spanish Pipe Dream. And the chorus of the song is, blow up your TV. Throw away your paper, move to the country, get you a farm. And it's fun, but at the same time, also brilliant. Yeah. Where John Prine saw this decades ago, how when we allow propaganda in the form of news or, whatever form it's coming in to dictate our emotional and energetic state, we're putting our future at risk. And by having, a little bit more, by standing guard to our mind and having a little bit more autonomy over our food supply chains and, some of the things that we require, it positions us to maintain our freedoms and sovereignty over our bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in some ways, I'm thankful that we no longer live in this age in which we basically had 3 information sources, maybe 1 local paper and 3 information news sources over TV. It's great to have more because it's actually possible. It's possible to ferret out more of the truth, I think, now than it would have been previously. On the other hand, the capacity for multimedia to indoctrinate and propagandize and distract us has never been more powerful. I mean, a grainy black and white TV just did not have anything like the power of social media over a smartphone that you carry on your body. And it's only going to get more powerful. And so I honestly think, I mean, there's something I honestly think that, for any of us listening, say in 2021 that you're going to become a more discerning consumer of media and social media and technology. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to go live in a cave, and abandon everything. I mean, here we are doing a podcast. On the other hand, you need to be discerning in your use of this.
I'm recording from a cave, though.
No, you are in a cave. Okay, good. I'm not in a cave. I'm just in a living room here in the middle, inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. But that's the thing, is that we just tend to, what's happened is that all these technologies just happened immediately. It went from not existing to every single one of us absorbing it and not really thinking about it. And we need to be discerning consumers of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. And this may piggyback on some of what you just shared, but what lessons do we need to learn to avoid a repeat of what just happened?
There's several things. I mean, the first is that we should absolutely not use predictive computer modeling to guide decision-making and public policy decision-making unless it's already been tested over and over against the evidence. And then so it's tested against the evidence, it can be reliable. We should just ignore those predictive models for purposes of decision-making. We should always insist on a careful balancing of both the costs and benefits. We should focus on responses in public health crises to known methods that actually help, like genuine quarantines of the sick and not untested ideas like general lockdowns. And we should be much, much more discerning about the appeal of public health officials to do these things. So look, if something in the abstract, the idea that, people can just tell you have to close down your business, can't go to church, can't go to school, can't go outside, right? No, we would all in the abstract recognize those are incredible violations of basic human rights. Then just saying, well, now you have to do it for public health reasons, that by itself shouldn't justify it. In fact, you say, okay, fine. I want to know what the argument is, though. Just because it's a public health argument doesn't suddenly make all those things okay. And in fact, if anything, the public health argument is probably going to be one that's always used because everybody now knows it's the most effective way of doing this. That would never have worked if you'd just been told, okay, you have to close all your private businesses. People would not have done that willingly for lots of other reasons, but for the most part, people did it willingly, not because they were told it's not for your own good, it's for the good of others. And so we have to become much, much more discerning and honestly more skeptical, I think, about this in the future, because I'm telling you, the public health appeals will be the tool of choice for every new attempt to basically increase social control over private businesses, individuals, and families. I guarantee you that's what we're going to get in the coming years if we let it.
Is there a call to action for lawyers, attorneys, light warriors for, I'm not calling out anyone individually, I'm just giving examples. We've talked about Neil Ferguson, who has an illustrious history of false predictive models. We know about Deborah Birx and Robert Redfield of the CDC. We've mentioned Bill Gates, of course, and Dr. Anthony Fauci and Tedros Ghebreyesus. These are people that many consider to be criminals. Is there a call to action here for attorneys and lawyers and light warriors to hold our public officials and mayors accountable?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's what's been missing so far. So what should have happened is that the moment businesses were forced to close, there should have been joint lawsuits against cities and states for this. The minute churches were told, okay, like in Washington, D.C., churches, no matter how big a church or a synagogue is, it's told, there's the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception is this giant Catholic church in Washington, D.C., seats 6,000 people in the upper church, and the city will only allow 50 people into this building at once. So they just decided this random number, 50. Now, why the Archdiocese of Washington didn't sue the mayor instantly is beyond me. It took about 9 months before they did this. If businesses and private organizations and charities and religious organizations were quicker, honestly, to take these public officials to court, a lot of this would already have been broken down. That's what people don't realize. The laws were already in place to deal with this. It's just that we've been terrified. I don't know that there's going to be, the only way actually to get get to the World Health Organization, we're not going to do it legally. It would be defunding. And I can say when President Trump was president, we had decided we were the number one funders of the World Health Organization, that we're going to quit funding it. That's basically how you get to some of these organizations. It's by way of funding. There's not really any way, I don't think, to deal with them politically per se or legally, but certainly with local officials, with mayors and governors, you can take them to court. And I think we need to be quicker to do that.
And Trump did defund the World Health Organization. I think we're all kind of waiting to see what's going to unfold here. And before we jump off and land this plane, I'm curious about what's been going on in DC. But just to kind of close out this point with, part of the problem that churches got themselves into was by organizing as a 501c3. And when churches do that, that exposes them to a lot of federal legislation and oversight that can interfere with their autonomy and their ability to, practice, freely assemble and practice religion. And I think we need to be aware of that. We're going to see in the coming months and years, more and more churches that say, all right, we're not going the 501c3 route, because in some ways that's a trap. And we're going to see underground churches and underground places of worship starting to rise up that make sure they are established from the very onset, to maintain their freedom and, our constitutional rights and the things that our forefathers fought so hard to provide for us.
Well, there's certainly, there's always these kinds of trade-offs. And you're right. If you're a 501c3, that's a specific tax designation. And so at the moment, either you're 501c3 or you're a for-profit effectively. And that has its own sort of entanglements. And so you're right. This is not the kind of the limited government ideal of the founders by any means. I think you're right. I think that churches and religious organizations that are at least not entangled in the sense that they're getting large amounts of government grants still have a lot of autonomy. On the other hand, if you're getting large government grants, like Catholic Charities, for instance, well, then all of a sudden you've got a lot more incentive to sort of comply, because, you basically your pipeline could get cut off. And I do think, honestly, I think that things are going to get hostile enough that you're right. It may be that we end up with more underground churches dealing with this, which is in one sense a regrettable thing, because you're more marginalized. But on the other hand, yeah, you're right. You do have in a sense more autonomy. I do think that there's some weird things coming. I would hate to, I'm not a prophet. I have no idea exactly what, but I do think that 2020 was a sort of foretaste of more things to come. And I think at the very least, as individual citizens, we need to learn some lessons so that we don't fall for the same arguments the second time.
Yeah. And, I have a question. There's so many businesses that have incurred massive financial losses in both revenue and profit. And then when you look at the businesses that have been additionally impacted by online censorship, let's say businesses that earn some of their money through social media like Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and have been censored on those platforms. Is there a case? And I know you're not a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer. We're just kind of spitballing here and having a conversation. Is there a case for tortious damages? Loss of revenue and profit, inability to fulfill on contractual agreements because of these lockdowns, people being forced to shut down their businesses, and businesses that have lost revenue because of censorship?
Well, honestly, I think at least there's a prima facie case for some businesses who were forced to lock down, especially if they can show that there was actually no medical need for it. And so I think in the case of restaurants, for instance, that there's really good data. So in New York, for instance, if you live in New York City, my friend William Briggs, a co-author on the book, The Price of Panic, he just walked around the streets yesterday and took a bunch of pictures of basically these makeshift tents and huts that restaurants have been forced to build outside, because people have to eat outside. They can't eat inside. But of course, it's cold in New York. Who wants to sit outside, right, and have dinner? And so they built these kind of shanties, essentially, which have zero ventilation or for people to sit in when they could be inside where it's well ventilated. There is no scientific or medical justification for this, and yet it's been devastating to businesses. And so I think somebody needs to press that. That hasn't quite happened yet. What's happened is that religious organizations communications in some states and municipalities have pushed and have gotten relief. Businesses have not yet done that, and I think that absolutely is going to have to happen. With respect to the censorship, I think that's still to come. I do think that the large social media giants, the platforms, they are public companies, private companies, but they benefit from a particular regulatory regime under Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act, in which they are given the freedom to be neutral platforms, right? So they're like AT&T, so they're not responsible for what's on their platform, but only as long as they're neutral platforms. So if they cease to be neutral platforms and start functioning as a publisher, I would argue they shouldn't get that regulatory protection. They should have to decide, are you going to be a publisher? Or are you going to be a neutral platform? And if you're going to be a neutral platform, you need to show it and not be basically censoring, on behalf of your preferred candidate or your preferred ideology. And so I think, all of these things, I think the one good thing about 2020 is I think there are millions of more Americans that are actually aware of the power of these things. They're aware of how easily media and social media can control the entire population and in some ways kind of transform society overnight. And so I think that awareness is good, but I think it's going to have to be channeled into something discerning and productive in order for us to learn the proper lessons, as opposed to, sort of going off half-cocked and then end up not being effective.
I agree. I'm seeing a lot of videos and images, and like last kind of two questions as we bring this home. I'm enjoying our conversation, and so thank you for sharing. And guys, if you're enjoying our conversation, please share this episode with friends, family, coworkers. Encourage them to give it 15, 20 minutes and decide for themselves, and also support Dr. Jay Richards' book, The Price of Panic, by picking up a copy on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. I'm seeing videos and pictures of 20, 30,000 troops in Washington, D.C. Streets are locked down. I'm curious, as someone that lives there, what are you seeing? What do you anticipate is going to take place in the coming days? And how do you think this is going to play out?
It's totally bizarre. And so we live way inside the Beltway. We used to live in the district. We live just outside the district, but inside the Beltway, which is the 495, the highway that goes around greater Washington, D.C. Within the center part of D.C., so where the mall and the Capitol and the White House are, there are about 25,000 National Guards, which includes regular infantry, a striker brigade. So these are big trucks with 50 caliber machine guns on them. There are apparently airplanes and even sort of surface to air missiles over on the side. I haven't seen any of those, but the National Guard, so you have that, you have chain link fence, you have razor wire around the Capitol, you have concrete barricades all around the place. And then now if you're out in the sort of outer parts of Washington, D.C., you will not see military, but you do see lockdown. So for instance, I was driving down 395 South yesterday, and the major exit on Main Avenue is 4 lanes wide to get off in DC, was blocked by 2 snow trucks, just basically blocking the highway. And so, and apparently tomorrow, so the day after inauguration, they're going to close all but one narrow bridge from Virginia, which is basically, if you don't have to be in DC, you're not going to want to be in DC. It's very strange because there's, if you live there, you have to get around and they're checking people's papers. I've heard from a couple of people that while it looks creepy, it's not quite as creepy if you're there, because these National Guardsmen, these are just people, ordinary people that are part-time National Guard, right? They get called up. And apparently a lot of them don't even have magazines in their guns. And so I do think a lot of this is more security theater rather than anything. It's just kind of this show of force. But it really is, in some ways it's historic that we should have what is in effect a lockdown. 25, it's like a couple of Army divisions worth of troops right in Washington, D.C., plus all the local police and the Capitol Police and things like this. Nobody is coming into D.C., I can tell you. There are not going to be any protesters here. It's not going to happen. It's going to be the most dismal and most depressing inauguration ever. And so it really, really is just absolutely bizarre. But yeah, if you're planning to come to DC, I would discourage anyone listening from doing that. There's nothing to see.
Yeah, and I saw that within the past few days, it seemed like President Trump released evidence that the Biden administration accepted money for a deal that they made with Ukraine, essentially using their political positions, and they accepted bribery in order to pass legislation. And it's kind of interesting in that if there is a transition taking place, it seems like Trump's done a decent job of kind of cutting off the nuts of the Biden administration with some of these moves.
Well, we'll see. Yeah, the Ukraine stuff and the Russiagate stuff, there have been declassifications there. It's still coming out. It's going to take months for us to research it. There's supposed to be 100 pardons and commutations of sentences here in the next 72 hours or so. So I think it could be very interesting. I honestly think, the president, this is my own opinion, has suffered at the hands of the so-called deep state, the administrative permanent state. And one of the best things he could do is, I think, some strategic declassifications and pardons that would actually kind of expose that. I think a lot of people see that, and honestly think he'd win a lot of friends, not just on the right, but on the left, to sort of challenge, I think, the security apparatus that's been built up and that he himself has unfortunately had to deal with. He was the ultimate outsider, and you see that. So it's a really weird moment in which we live. It's hard to believe that this is like major historic events happening all one on top of the other, unfortunately.
It's a very exciting time to be alive. My dad, I grew up with my dad reading Tom Clancy novels, and I was like, Dad, we're like living in the best Tom Clancy novel that's never been written right now.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure some of it's theater and some of it's real, and we'll kind of, that'll all come out, sort itself out as we kind of keep taking steps forward. Last question. What do you kind of predict for the future? We have a huge portion of the population that has said they won't get this drug, that is being called a vaccine, no matter what. And then we also see a situation where a lot of these industries may very well be owned and controlled by the central banks and insurance companies. The same oligarchs that likely are running many, if not most, of the world's governments. Do you see secondary markets, new airline industries that don't require vaccinations, and businesses kind of emerging? What do you see for the future, and what do you predict?
I hope so. I do predict, I think your diagnosis of an emerging oligarchy is actually exactly right. I've written a lot of books on the dangers of socialism and communism in the 20th century, but this kind of state socialism where the government literally owns everything, it's really a dysfunctional system. And you own
nothing and will like it.
Yeah, and you will love it. And it just destroys the economy.
Thank you, sir. May I have another?
Exactly. But this kind of cronyism, this oligarchy in which you have these large corporate entities that are sort of controlled by the state, and then the state, which is sort of controlled by these large corporate entities, kind of fusing. So there's this kind of machine of social control. I think that's actually the primary danger here at the beginning of the 21st century, is that kind of cronyist oligarchy, corporatism, you could call it sort of technically. I think that's the real danger. I think that's what we're seeing with social media suppression. And so I think that's the thing that we need to learn how to deal with. I think secondary markets would be a really nice, maybe Gab takes off and challenges Twitter. But as you can see, as in any kind of cronyist system, the big actors want to do everything they can to squelch small upstart competitors, and that's, I think, what we're seeing here. And as you say,
or just buy them out.
Yeah, exactly. Buy them out if they've got a good technology, you buy them, or otherwise you prevent them from ever prospering. And so that's going to be the danger. There's going to be a strong incentive either for a legal secondary market or a so-called gray market for transportation, if for people that don't want to have the vaccine, for instance. On the other hand, I think the reality is that a virus is going to do what a virus does. And so it is eventually going to work its way into most of the population, the healthy population. We're going to build up an immunity to it, whether we get the vaccine or not. And so the kind of pressure to do that, I think, will be off. That's why I think they're wanting us to do it all right now, because after we get through a couple of real full respiratory seasons of this virus, I think it will work its way back down into the background noise, just like the cold virus does. And so that's the reality, is that there'll be a cold, flu, and coronavirus season from now on. And I think the population will adapt.
I agree. And I think there's a huge opportunity, perhaps an opportunity like never before seen in human history, for entrepreneurs and people to anticipate and serve these emerging needs, especially if you're mission driven and your goal is not just a big buyout, because if your goal is a big buyout, you're likely going to end up creating something that just gets, sucked into the machine or ate up by the beast, and that very change that you may have got into, that business in order to create and bring to fruition then becomes jeopardized, and again, it comes down to the morality of the people and us holding ourselves to, not to harp, but the laws of God, natural law, rather than the laws of man, and doing things for more than just these debt squares, this fiat currency that's not backed by anything.
Absolutely.
Dr. Jay Richards, this has been an awesome conversation. I've really had a lot of fun, and I think you shared some amazing stuff with our listeners. Guys, support Dr. Richards by picking up The Price of Panic on Amazon or wherever you buy books. And Dr. Richards, please let's stay in touch and
Definitely.
keep me updated with things you're working on. And as stuff goes on, maybe we'll do a part 2.
Terrific. Great to be with you.
What's up, guys? Anthony here, and thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Biohacking Secrets Show. One of my favorite things to do is helping men and women like you feel what it's like with the body you've always wanted and all-day energy that starts the moment you wake up and doesn't quit. Over the past decade, we've created a proprietary health assessment that helps me to identify the unique toxicities and deficiencies that may be holding you back from the life that you deserve. And what we've discovered in doing this with now thousands of CEOs, executives, professional athletes, businessmen, Hollywood celebrities, and entrepreneurs is that there's always room for improvement and optimization. Whether you're already performing at a high level or you have that feeling inside your heart that you're capable of more, the single fastest way to unlock your potential is to upgrade your mind and your body. And there's no program on earth that does that faster or to a greater magnitude than our one-on-one consulting program at www.biohackingsecrets.com/coaching. We start with our proprietary health assessment that screens you for vitamin deficiencies like A, D, magnesium, iron, etc., high cholesterol and heart disease, high blood pressure, digestive disorders, hidden infections like Lyme, Epstein-Barr, parasites, SIBO, Candida, and more that can just drain your energy in the background, especially if you don't know about them. Anxiety, depression, and cognitive disorders, autoimmune disease, adrenal fatigue, thyroid issues, mold toxicity, heavy metals, environmental toxins, and other genetic risk factors like MTHFR, APOE status, your glutathione production, and many more. We even recommend the specific tests that I use with my one-on-one clients if they're relevant for you in figuring out your biological age and identifying those key areas and opportunities that can take your life to the next level. From there, we create a customized game plan along with a personalized supplement protocol to help you optimize your weight and energy at the cellular level. And for our platinum clients, we even include a personalized workshop with me in Delray Beach, Florida. Most of the year, this program's full with a waiting list, but we just had a couple spots open up and I wanted to offer them to the listeners of the Biohacking Secrets Show first. So if you're interested in seeing what it might look like for us to work together, head over to www.biohackingsecrets.com/coaching. That's www.biohackingsecrets.com/COACHING and fill out the short application form. If you're pre-approved, you'll be given the opportunity to book a time to connect with someone on our team and see if it's a fit. Thank you so much for being a part of this community, and I look forward to potentially going on this journey together.